السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم ربنا لك الحمد على ما أنعمت علينا من نعم لا تحصى يا رب العالمين. اللهم اجعلنا من الشاكرين لأنعمك يا أكرم. أصول حقائق الدين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons in Usul al-Fiqh, we opened last week with the first of the lessons on the text itself, by the grace of Allah, mighty and majestic, right? And it's very important always to remind ourselves that it's a tremendous blessing, right, to be on the path of knowledge, whether conveying it or receiving it, right? And everybody on the path of knowledge is always a seeker, right? Because ultimately, whether you're a teacher or a student, you're seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But also, the teacher learns more than the student if they're a committed teacher as they teach. And that's something the mashayikh would always mention to us, right? And I thought initially when I first heard it was from Sheikh Talal al-Ahdab, I thought he was just sort of being humble or something, but it's just the truth, right? Alhamdulillah. We saw the author's opening and his definition of key terms, right? And there is a student's method, right? There is a student's method that we should keep in mind, right? And what is the student's method? The student's method is, as you progress, each lesson, before the lesson, you ask yourself, what was covered in the previous lesson? And can you test yourself with respect to that, right? So you ask yourself, okay, what did we cover last lesson? Right? And ideally, closed book, just ask yourself, okay, what did we cover last lesson? Okay, what were the key terms? What do they mean? Can I explain them? Good. Or at the very least, if you see the terms, can you give them? Can you give their definitions, right? And that's how each class you go forward. It's like a caravan, right? They say, the journey of seeking knowledge, because you're acquiring knowledge, right? من سلك طريقا يلتمس فيه علما. Whoever pursues a path seeking knowledge therein. So on the path to the aims of knowledge, of the hereafter, the pleasure of Allah, the closeness to Allah, right? And what we do with the knowledge in this life, of acting on it, of spreading it, in that you are acquiring knowledge, right? So it's good to think of it like a caravan, right? The caravan needs a few things, right? You need a horse. You are the horse, right? You got it. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Nafsuka matiyatuka." Yourself is your mount. Farfuq biha. So go easy on it. Go easy on it, not slack off, but take on from actions what you can sustain, etc. Right? And there's many metaphors of this, of the journey of knowledge, right? But then also, right? Also, you need something to store the knowledge with, right? That's your hifz, right? So you need something to store the knowledge in, right? Like you need a carriage, right? The carriage is the wi'a, right? The wi'a of your consciousness, right? Of your aql, right? The carriage, right? And you have to give it the tools for it to be able to do something with that knowledge, but also you need to retain it. If you have a carriage that you put things in it, and as you move forward, everything falls out, you'll just keep going in circles, right? So you got to retain that. But also, a long journey is difficult on your own, which is why companions on the journey are important. Right? You need a guide who are your teachers to show you the way. But you also need companions on that journey, right? And they help you because the journey has its twists and turns, its uphill trek, its winter, its heat, right? Its thirst, all the different tests that are just entailed by any real journey. Fa, so so it's important to reflect on the implications um, of that um, um, of that metaphor, right? So today we're going to begin, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, with lesson number 2, right? And this, and it's important to just appreciate this blessing, right? Because يعني العالم والمتعلم شريكان في الخير. Our beloved sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam said that the teacher and the student are partners in good, right? And that is such a tremendous blessing, right? That if you can be in the partnership of good, right, in this life, right? But the good, we renew intentions in it. We are clear in the purpose of it and why we're pursuing what we're pursuing when we're pursuing it. So those are things that we keep in mind بإذنه سبحانه وتعالى. Let us begin. So in lesson 2, by the grace of Allah mighty and majestic, in al-Aqhisari's Samt al-Wusul, and I was pronouncing it al-Aqhisari, but a few Turks and a few Bosnians reached out to me, and with great adab, right? But an error made in public should be corrected in public. It appears very clearly to be, even though some sources mention it as al-Aqhisari, but it is actually with a kasra, al-Aqhisari. It's 2 words, aq and hisar, right? Or hisar in Arabic, right? With the kasra. And then there's a female Bosnian scholar who reached out. She actually didn't comment on the error, right? She was very happy that a Bosnian scholar's work was being taught. So I just asked her, and she confirmed, and she gave, some background on it, and I confirmed further. So it is al-Aqhisari. Okay, Bismillah. So today we're going to be looking at the first foundational source, which is the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. So this work, Samt al-Wusul ila ilm al-Usul, by Hassan Kafi al-Aqhisari, right? Which it is one of the best of the abridgments of the Manar of Imam al-Nasafi, but he also does many things that will be of benefit to you when you get to the Manar, right? Because he refines many definitions, the way he classifies things. So this is not just a stage in the journey, but what you take from here, this will benefit you significantly in the future. And al-Aqhisari died in the year 1025. You can listen to the previous lesson for the details of that. And for those of you who are new, you can register for the class, and that way you can have access to the material and content and so on. بإذنه subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, the okay, Bismillah. So, Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. So, in the first lesson, we looked at certain key definitions, right, of terms that we need to understand. And we'll leave it to you, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, because now, you are a talib ilm, and, you appreciate the need to retain knowledge. So this is something that you go and review and consolidate and thereby build upon bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So here we're going to go beyond that and look at the first of the principles. And you'll notice a matter of method, right? A matter of method that, and this is mentioned beautifully in a commentary on the Ajrumiyya, right? Which is Hashiyat al-Ashmawi, which is arguably the most precise um, of the commentaries of the Ajrumiyya, right, by al-Ashmawi, that the earlier scholars would mention the issues sardan, right, just one after the other, right, and then they would give summaries afterwards, right? So they'd present the issue and then summarize, right? So they mention things and then they'd summarize. That is called tafsil thumma al-ijmal. They'd mention the details and then mention the summaries. So that now you've covered it, this is how it is summarized. The later scholars generally followed the way of ijmal thumma tafsil, mentioning the issue in summary and then detailing it, right? But simple texts make the ijmal, the summary, they make the summary explicit, right? Whereas other texts deliberately don't make the summary explicit. And we'll see an example of that, right? So he says that the usul of the shara are 4. The first is this. The second will be mentioned later. The third after that, right? So he's making an ijmal that there's 4, right? And this is also a type of training, right? That you are not reading a murder mystery that, oh, I wonder what's the second one, right? So in this, it is left to the student, right, to build their mental map of the issue, that there are 4 principles. So the first is the book, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. But the others, which will be mentioned later, right, you can do a macro mapping of the text in advance, even if you don't fully understand. Okay, there's 4 usul, so you go and map it out. There's the book. Okay, these are the investigations of the book. Then there's the sunnah. There's investigation of sunnah, but you don't go into the details. The third is ijma. There's investigations related to it. Okay, what's the fourth? Qiyas. There's investigation. Okay, what else does the book cover? Right, so you get the big picture. And one of the wisdoms of the method used by al-Aqhisari here, and others do this as well, is to cultivate the student's capacity, right? To invite them. Go ahead. The text is in front of you, right? The text is in front of you. And this is part of an important scholarly method, right? Because the texts are not just teaching you issues, they're teaching you, right, to have the malaka, the capacity of knowing, right? And the capacity of thinking and the capacity to have the skills of being having al-fiqh fi din, right? To have the deep understanding of religion, right? And that deep understanding of religion entails that one has this isti'dad, right? That one has this capacity to reason, think, and apply the tools of thinking, right? And that's very, very important, right? That is very, very important. So that's why Imam al-Aqhisari says, وَهِيَ أَرْبَعَةٌ, right? وَهِيَ أَرْبَعَةٌ, right? That the principles of the usul al-fiqh are 4. Okay? Are 4. الأصل الأول, right? So he says الباب الأول في الأصول, right? the first chapter, al-Bab al-Awwal fi al-Usul. The first chapter, because he tells us, we closed off that. The book is divided into two parts. The first is in the Usul, and then, right, and you can, already you should have a map. The first chapter is in this. What is the second chapter? What is the second part of the book on? Open it up. You can see, right? And you can start doing, you can almost like have your own whiteboard of the book. The Bab al-Awwal is this, fil usul. What's the Bab al-Thani, right? And sometimes the mashayikh would ask those questions. So what is the second Bab, right? And that would give them a sense of where the students are at. So let's rise up to that, right? The first chapter is in the usul, right? These are ma yubtana alayhi ghayruhu, right? Right? These are al-usul. These are the usul. The al here. What kind of al is this, folks? What kind of al is this? Yeah, this al is lil ahd, right? This is al-usul, meaning usul al-fiqh, right? Al-usul meaning usul al-fiqh, right? So this al is iwad an mudaf, is in the place of a mudaf, or it's lil ahd. The foundational proofs, the foundation, the foundational principles, foundational sources, i.e., of fiqh, right? That's necessarily implicit. وهي أربعة. There are four. الأصل الأول الكتاب. The first principle, the first foundational source is the book. وهو القرآن المنزل على الرسول صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم المنقول عنه متواترا وهو نظم ومعنى معا. Right? So the book, the first principle is the book. And that is the Quran, revealed upon the messenger. Peace and blessings be upon him. Transmitted from him through mass transmission. And it is, and it, وهو أي الكتاب القرآن هو نظم ومعنى معا. It is the words and the meanings together. وأقسامهما, and their categories are four. And their categories are four. So we'll do a mujmal explanation first and then go into the details, right? So he says, الكتاب هو وهو القرآن, right? And the reason he mentions al-kitab huwa al-Quran, right? Why don't just define the Quran? Because the Quran, right? The Quran is the Quran indicates that which is indicated by the divine attribute of speech. Right? The divine attribute of speech is eternal. The book is revealed. The book is revealed. What it indicates is what is indicated by the eternal book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But usul al-fiqh is not looking at directly the divine attribute of speech and its eternal and its indications insofar as the speech itself. Rather, it's looking at the revealed book and its indications, which are what is indicated by the divine attribute of speech. So because of this nuance, he said, هو القرآن المنزل, right? It is the Quran, right, that is revealed to the Prophet, which indicates what is indicated by the divine attribute of speech, right? And if you want to look in Nur al-Anwar, etc., they unpack this a little bit. Right? But that's why they use, it's a very carefully expressed thing, right? And right? And then he says, right? That's huwa al-Quran, right? It is the Quran revealed, right? So we need to understand revelation. Ala Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, right? Ar-Rasul, this al here is again referential, right? Lil ahad. Rasulullah, Sayyiduna Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and it's mentioned in this way. This is has, by mentioning it in, without using his explicit name, meaning he is adhar min an yusarrah bihi. He is so well known, you don't have to mention his name explicitly, right? Ar-Rasul, it's known who it is, right? The messenger, it's our messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam. There's also a point of adab here that anytime you read a text and the name of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is mentioned, you should, even when you're reading on your own, you should explicitly state the salawat. Don't just have them in your mind or whatever. You say it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? You say it. Al-Badr ibn Jama'ah, in his work on the adab of knowledge, Tazkiratu al-Sami' wal-Mutakallim, mentions that explicitly. And many others as well. Al-Manqul anhu, that is transmitted from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam through mass transmission, and we'll see the definition of mass transmission, right? And huwa nadhmun wa ma'nan ma'an, right? Many texts mention that it's huwa nadhmu dallu ala al-ma'na, huwa nadhmu wal ma'na, right? Right? It is the words and the meanings. So it would make it seem as if the Quran is words plus meanings. Right? Or it's words and meanings. Al-lafz wal-ma'na. Right? Al-nadhm wal-ma'na. Now, nadhm is a synonym for lafz, but they use nadhm, right? Because nadhm is that which is rightfully, that which is perfectly arranged, right? Lafz in the lexical sense is that which is cast forth. Al-lafadha is a rama, right? Say lafadhtu nawa min fami. You cast out a, like a date seed or whatever from your mouth. It doesn't necessarily indicate that, but they found this latifa and they stuck with it. There's nothing wrong with calling it Alfadhul Quran, and great works in Islam have been called Alfadhul Quran, such as Raghib al-Isfahani's Mufradat and so on. Okay. Huwa nadhmun wa ma'nan ma'an. It is the words and the meanings together, right? Others expressed it, huwa lafz, huwa nadhmu dallu ala al-ma'na, right? It is the words that indicate the meanings, and we'll explain that, right? Together, right? It's not just the words, but it's the words that indicate the meanings, right? And then he says, وَأَقْسَامُهُمَا, and the categories, i.e. of words and meanings. And again, there's a nuance, because many texts say, وَأَقْسَامُهَا, right? This is not a categorization of the Quran. It's, because you could categorize the Quran in different ways, right? But here, أقسامهما, أي أقسام النظم والمعنى, the categories of the words, insofar as they indicate meanings, are 4, right? So these are nuances in the text, right? These are nuances in the text that already you see a whole number of points of method and refinement that al-Aqhisari brings in. And you can, if someone wants to sort of nerd it out, you could keep a copy of the Manar with you, and you could notice these things, and you would do well. Like when you go ahead, there's a lot of good points of benefit here that you could. But he's also a modest commentator, right? Because he doesn't flaunt his muscles a lot. He's doing it's clear that he, al-Aqhisari, he comes after many a giant, right? who wrote the commentaries on the Manar, right? It's evident that he knows those works and the other works that he alluded to in his opening lesson. But if you look at his commentary, it is precise, it is brief, it is precise, it hits what needs to be hit, but he has this blessed humility, right? He doesn't say, look, and this is better. Like, he's very, and you can say that. And when the ulama point out that this is far superior and this and that, they do it to make you aware of what is of benefit, but he has this really distinct humility. Okay, so there are 4 foundational principles, right? So here you see this method of making the students think. There are 4 principles, but he details only the first, right? And make this a part of your toolkit as a student, right? That don't treat your books like murder mysteries. Imam, it's mentioned that that one of the great theologians, right, before he went to study the Shamsiyya under its commentator, before give me the other. This 1 second, folks. Yeah, sorry. I have a powered Bismillah. So before he went to study, Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. So before he went to study the Shamsiyya under one of its commentators, he had read the text 14 times cover to cover, and he'd written 2 sets of marginal notes on it himself, right? Before he studied it. Of course, he had done a lot of study before and so on. He was already at a level of great scholarship, right? Before he got to before he went to study. But that's the kind of scholarship, that's the kind of scholarship that is of, that bears real fruit, right? That bears real fruit, right? That he'd studied it 14 times cover to cover, right? So, but that's a big deal, right? That's a big deal. But you see so many examples of the ulama who, really, and that's how they became who they became, right? And of course, but how do you do that? Through guidance, right? If you're going on a journey through uncharted territory, you have to trust your guide. Because if you just chart out your own route, you get cut off. And if you're cut off, you'll perish, right? You'll perish. And that defeats the purpose, right? So you're making the students think. But then he gives us this definition of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You'll notice things about this definition. And you would have noticed, if you covered Mukhtasar al-Manar, you would have noticed, right, that there are things related to the definition of the Quran that are not mentioned here. Particularly, one of the important aspects of the Quran is the fact that it is that it is inimitable, right? It's written in the Mus'haf, right? Memorized, etc. Right? There's different elements, but the concern of the ulama of usul al-fiqh are not those elements of the definition. The concern of the ulama of usul al-fiqh is to define the book, right? Define the revelation as the revealed text from which we can derive law, right? That is the i'tibar of the ulama of usul, right? The ulama of usul are not looking at this as being, they're taking the other elements related to the theological elements of the book of Allah as a given, right? So the aslul usul is ilmul kalam, right? Right? The foundation of the foundations is theology, right? That establishes what we believe, right? But then usul al-fiqh is now, okay, how do we understand revelation, right? But usul al-fiqh in that sense is built upon ilm al-kalam, right? Is built upon ilm al-kalam. So we are not, the concern of the usuli is not to establish that Allah exists. It's not to establish that Allah Most High has attributes. That Allah Most High, from His attributes that are affirmed, is that He has the attribute of speech. It is not the concern of the usuli as the scholar of usul al-fiqh, as a scholar of usul al-fiqh, to then explain that the divine attribute of speech is an eternal attribute, transcendent, absolutely dissimilar, right? Not made up of parts, without beginning, middle, and end, etc. But this divine attribute of speech is a sifatun thubutiyatun qa'imatun bidhatihi ta'ala منزهة عن سمات الحدوث, transcendence beyond any of the characteristics of originatedness. من تركيب ولفظ وصوت. It is not made up of parts or words or sounds, وحروف and letters, or any of these matters. تدل, right? It indicates على الواجب والجائز والمستحيل, right? It indicates, أو تدل على ما يدل عليه صفة العلم. It indicates what is indicated by the divine attribute of knowledge. And that you should have studied, and if you're attentive, in level 1 in the Khalid al-Bahiyya, but also in level 2 when you study either the Sanusiyya, or you study Qawa'id al-Aqa'id, or you study the commentary of As-Sawi on Jawharat al-Tawheed, etc. You would know that discussion, right? And presently we're also doing at level 1 Maturidi Aqidah, and covering al-Ushi's Bad al-Amali, and we'll be doing further texts in Maturidi Aqidah bi'idhnillahi ta'ala as well. So all of that you would be clear about, right? But the Quran, right? The Quran can refer to, right? The Quran can refer to the eternal meaning or the revealed book, right? Now, he's saying al-kitab, we are concerned in revelation as legal text, right? And this is very important. Usul al-fiqh is principles of textual interpretation, right? It is textual, right? How do you interpret the text of the Quran? How do we interpret the text, i.e. the transmission, right, of the Sunnah? How do we interpret, right, and then how do we then extend that through consensus, through analogy, and the secondary interpretive tools. That's very, very important, right? We don't do funny business. Fiqh is not, and deen is not based on opinion, right? And there is a dhammul ra'i, there's a blameworthiness of what's called ra'i, right? Of mere opinion, which is the subjective individual determination of religion, that the way I see it. What do you see? Right? In al-hukmu illa lillah, the command is only Allah's. Everything else is acting on the behalf of divine with authority, right? With authority. So that's why he mentions the book, al-kitab, right? Because the Quran has the consideration of it is the eternal meanings indicated, but here we're talking about the text that is revealed that indicates those meanings, right? But without getting into the theological details, because that's not the primary concern here. Right? Now, what a student of knowledge does, if some of this is unclear, sometimes you can jump in, right? You can jump in to a subject just to get what you need from that subject, right? So if you haven't, for example, studied Aqidah before, what you could do is you could register for example, the Kharida class and go, okay, where is this attribute of speech covered? And listen to that. So, okay, good. Right? You could register for another class, go take that thing, and you could even deregister if you want to just take it later and not appear as a student. You go, take what you need, and go. And sometimes you'd see advanced students. When I was in Damascus, two of my teachers they already had their shahada ilmiya, etc., but they're still actively studying with the mashayikh, and sometimes they say, Sheikh so-and-so will be covering such and such investigation. So they would go and attend to catch that investigation. And go on. Other times, they would consult, where is a good discussion on such and such point? They'd find it in the text, they'd read it, and they'd go to their teachers and say, could you explain this issue to me? Right? Because it's not the place in the class, right? So we want to convey this scholarly method, right? And that's how we become seekers of knowledge, right? Because the student of knowledge begins only metaphorically a student of knowledge, right? That they're aspiring, inshallah, to become a seeker of knowledge. But it's only once they acquire the capacity and the basic tools, are they now really a talib ilm? Okay, this has three aspects, right? Being able to define what is revelation, right? It being to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and tawatur. There are three elements to this definition, right? And it's good just to ta'rif al-Quran, and this is ta'rif al-Quran, the definition of the Quran, or ta'rif al-Kitab, right? Meaning according to ulama of usul, the critical element that they don't mention here, that is frequently mentioned, is its inimitability. And the ulama of that is the primary that's the primary consideration for the theologians. Its inimitability, because that is the truth claim of the Quran, and that is the truth claim of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that is one of the ways of arguing for God. Right? God exists because look at the Quran. Right? The fuqaha who look at human actions would add in the definition of the Quran al-muta'abbad bi-tilawatihi, whose recitation is an act of devotion. Right? It's a ibadah. Right? And because from that ta'abbud is a ta'abbud that is wajib, which is to recite at least one verse in the prayer. For the Hanafis, the wajib to recite the Fatiha an extent of 3 surahs, to recite the sunnah recitation is sunnah, right? To do khatm of it in Ramadan is sunnah. To do khatm of it at least twice a year, according to Abu Hanifa, you fulfill the right of the Quran generally, but the Salaf, in their habit was to at least do the Quran on a monthly basis. Much of the Sahaba appear to have recited the Quran at least twice a month. Those elements relate to the ulama of fiqh. The people of the spiritual path look at the Quran, that if this is the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then when you are reciting it, you are in the divine presence. You are in the divine presence. Can you just keep track of the chat? Right? You are in the divine presence. And as a result, their concern is, what are the inward adab of the Quran? And and Imam al-Ghazali discusses those in, I think it's book 8 on adab al-Quran in the Ihya. And we have a course on the adab al-Quran, and we covered that section. And the principal adab there is summarized by Habib Hassan al-Bahr al-Jifri in one statement in his work Sifatu Salat al-Muqarrabin, the description of the prayer of those close to God, that washhadhu fi kalamihi, behold him, behold Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his speech. Right? Because when you're reciting the Quran, you are being addressed by God, so you're in a particular presence with the divine. Those and such investigations are, and how to get to that, right, are the concerns of DOST, Department of Spiritual Things, right? So how you talk about the Quran depends. What are you talking theologically, according to Ilm al-Kalam or Usul al-Din, or according to Usul al-Fiqh, or according to the ulama of Ilm al-Fiqh, or are you talking about the ulama of Tasawwuf, or beyond that, there's other considerations, right? There's the considerations of Ulum al-Quran itself, to understand the Quran itself and its investigations, right? Because they will include things like al-maktub fil masahif, because one of the things is about hifzul mushaf, the preservation of the text of the Quran, right? Even though that is a descriptive element of it, and so on, right? If the muhaddithin looked at it, for them the greatest point of interest would be its tawatur. How do you establish its tawatur? Right? And the elements of its transmission. Although the standards of transmission of Quran differ from the standards of hadith transmission, and that's a separate element, right? Okay. So this is the usuli definition, right? And if you wish, you can, if you look in a book of Ulum al-Quran, you can see comprehensive elements of its definition, right? And here we should share as a supporting text, inshallah, as a supporting text, we should share Mufti Taqi Usmani's work on Ulum al-Quran. Let's try to find a clean edition and share that here, bi'idhnillah. So just to close part 1 of today's lesson, here there are questions to ask ourselves, right? The first of the questions is, what is revelation, right? What is revelation, right? So al-munazzal, that has come down, and this is something that we discussed in level 1 in the course on how Islam works. We talked about it a little bit there, and in level 2 it comes up in the course very capably taught by Sheikh Abdul Rahim Riyasat on Ulum al-Quran, on the sciences of the Quran, right? So what is revelation? What is wahi? But in Usul al-Fiqh, we're not concerned directly about defining revelation and the nature of revelation and the truth of revelation, because those are the concerns of Ilm al-Kalam in one perspective and Ulum al-Quran in another perspective. But the Talib al-Ilm needs to be able to connect their knowledge together, because the investigation on the Quran, as we were looking at Usul al-Fiqh, relates to Aqidah, to know the truth claim of the Quran, but also to understand, okay, what is revelation? And that is discussed by Ulum al-Quran. Right? But being able to put these together is very important. This is something we'll unpack later, but this also for Tulab ilm, so here you should be able to answer the question, what is the proof that revelation is true? Right? Now it has come down upon our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? It's come down upon our Messenger sallallahu ta'ala alaihi wasallam, right? Al-Munazzal is that which is revealed. It is revelation, right? It is revelation. So it being revelation, of course, you hear that has come down, right? That has come down. So Al-Munazzal, right? And making these connections is important because on their own, unless you make these explicit connections, you may be left with a little bit of a hole in your understanding, right? A little bit of a hole in your understanding. Here, to appreciate the reality of revelation as well, you need to know this key issue of inimitability, the i'jaz of the Quran, right? So we need to be able to do two things, right? And we'll share the readings related to both of these, which are, what is wahi, right? What is revelation, right? What is wahi, right? And the inimitability of the Quran, the i'jaz of the Quran. And a very good book of Usul al-Fiqh that we'll share as a resource for this course is Al-Muyassar of Sheikh Ibrahim Silqini, the teacher of our teachers. Sheikh Muhammad Qaylish studied with him. Dr. Mahmoud Masri is very close with him, etc. Right? Al-Muyassar of Sheikh Ibrahim Silqini, a great Hanafi faqih of Aleppo. Right? The traditionally trained faqih, but very capable alim, right? Of again, recent decades, passed away a decade ago, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. And also for that's in Arabic, and in English, these, we'll share the book as one of the recommended resources for the course, but under this lesson number 2, you'll see the related sections from Mufti Taqiy's Ulum al-Quran, right? Bi'idhnillah, on understanding what is revelation, what is wahi, and the proof that the Quran is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And that, that is highly recommended reading. And you could do one or the other. If you do both, has a sharafa, right? وَمَنْ جَمَعَ بَيْنَهُمَا has a sharafa. Whoever joins between them attains nobility. And upon the Messenger, sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam, this al is lil ahad, right? And right now, he mentions then, right? And this is, of course, a statement of honor for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Right? By not mentioning his name, that's one of the ways, like, and you see that rhetorical thing in the Quran. لَقَدْ مَنَّ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ بَعَثَ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْ أَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah has indeed blessed the believers when He sent down to them a messenger from amongst themselves. A messenger from amongst themselves. A messenger. This is tafkhim. The messenger. So He specified, but you know who it is. Right? So, and in that, of course, there's an implicit pointing that you know that He is a Nabi al-Rasul bila shak. And He is clearly the messenger. Right? How do you know He's a messenger? That's the subject matter of ilm al-kalam and supporting sciences such as dala'il al-nubuwah, the proofs of prophethood, etc. Right? Round up your knowledge. Right? Then mass transmitted. Right? Mass transmitted. Now, it being mass transmitted, right? And we'll look at the issue of transmission when we come to it. There are levels of transmission. There are levels of transmission. The revelation, right? The revelation right? Um, right? And there are some people who are confused about these things. So when we come to the issue of revelation, but we have to understand that the Quran as it at the heart of the revelation of the Quran is the revelation of this meaning, this meaning of guidance. From the wisdom of the Quran being revealed as it is revealed is that it, the qira'at, the various recitations facilitate bringing out the nuances of meaning of the Quran, right? So that, because individual words are not always sufficient to encompass the shades of the meaning. Like, for example, in the Fatiha, right? By there being the within the 10 qira'at, there is Maliki Yawmiddin, like we have in Hafs, and Maliki Yawmiddin, right? The master and the king. And these are related, but they bring out two nuances of meaning, and so on, right? So then there are degrees of transmission from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam of the text of the Quran, right? What is Quran itself is what is mass transmitted. That is the Quran itself. Then there's other things that are naqlan mutawatiran. Some add, as al-Marjani mentions in his matan, مشارع الوصول, نقلا متواترا بلا شبهة, mass transmitted without any shubha in its tawatur, right? But there's other levels of sound transmission and there's unsound transmission. The unsound transmission is not Quran to begin with, right? But there are levels of sound transmission. There are that which is there's shubha in its tawatur, and there's that which is widely transmitted, that's mashhur. There's ahad, there's singular transmissions, but it's all of the same text. Of these, that which is soundly transmitted, only what is mass transmitted is considered Quran. But the other things, what do? They bring out shades of meaning. They bring out shades of meaning. And so there's no issue that the fact that, there's a slightly different way that some Sahabi said this. Instead of saying yabtaghi tabtaghi, right? And these nuances, and they say, we found this and that. They say, ريح بالك, calm down. Just open any book of Usul al-Fiqh, right? And the Hanafis go into that. It's right there, right? So don't, it's not something we can spend a lot of time on. And alhamdulillah, Sheikh Abdul Rahim Riyasat, who's a capable Hanafi scholar, but he's trained in ulum al-Quran, and he covers some of these things in his Quran, Quranic literacy certificate. This is a non-issue, but you also have to be wary of just listening to, these social media, different personalities on social media. Just because someone's a personality does not mean they're an expert. And also one of the fitnas of an age of academia is that people, now you get whatever title before your name, you can speak about anything. Whereas the ulama speak about their specialty or the range of issues they don't hesitate to say, I don't know, or to point to someone more learned than them, even in their own specialty. Or they'll say, that's a good question. Let's open the book and see what this person says. And they explain from the books because they're connected with the books. They're connected with their seniors. They're connected with their peers. Right? So that, so that's a non-issue, right? And we'll come to a little bit more of this when we come to the discussion on tawatur. But there's that, but the tawatur, the mass transmission, which is that in each age it is transmitted so clearly by so many people that there could be no collusion in there could be no collusion upon error, and they could not collude to fabricate this, right? So that's naqlan mutawatiran. And then he says its categories are four. Sorry, there's one more thing. He says wasmun wa huwa nadhmun wa ma'nan ma'an. It is the words and the meanings together. Now, al-Aqhisari himself says al-muradu min al-nadhm al-lafz. What is meant by al-nadhm is al-lafz. إلا أنه لم يذكره رعاية للأدب. But he did not use the term lafz out of adab. And we explained that, right? And he gives it very beautifully. Right? And وهو نظم ومعنى معا. It is the words and the meanings together, right? And that is the relied upon position in the Hanafi school. Some scholars to highlight the difference because originally Imam Hanifa had a nuanced opinion that the ma'na, that there are two elements. What the Quran is, the words and the meanings, but so these are two arkan of it. There's one integral, that which is the meaning itself, that is necessarily required. The words is rukn qabil lis-suqut, right? That because of various evidences, amongst them, for example, what's come in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, وَإِنَّهُ لَفِي زُبُرِ الْأَوَّلِينَ, and indeed it is in the past scriptures, which would be the meaning, right, etc. However, from the earliest authorities affirm that Imam Abu Hanifa left his position to the position of his companions, right, with respect to not being able to recite in other than Arabic, etc., unless you're unable, etc. And that's a separate matter that's discussed in fiqh, and you should be familiar if you've studied anything, what Nur al-Idah or Quduri or Kanz, should be familiar with that issue. Just beware the footnotes. I would strongly encourage, unless I point out the footnotes go left, right, and all over the place sometimes. Some of them are very good, some are very poor. And sometimes he brings in too many details that would obscure the issue rather than clarify the issue. So we'll be very selective in is the words, right, and the meanings together. So it's, or as others put it, right, like like al-Haskafi and Ibn Abdin in Ifadat al-Anwar with Ibn Abdin's al-Haskafi's commentary on the Manar. It's called Ifadat al-Anwar with Ibn Abdin's Nasamat al-Ashar. Wasmun للنظم الدال على المعنى. It is the names for the text that indicates the meaning, right? So it's not A plus B, but it is the Quran is the words insofar as they indicate the meanings, right? And for those of you who like Imam al-Khadimi, right? Imam al-Khadimi has a beautiful matan in Usul al-Fiqh called Majami' al-Haqa'iq, the gatherings, the gathering places of realities. And it's a wonderful matan in Usul. It's sort of more nuanced than the Manar in its nuance, though with less detail. He and others discuss that, but you don't have to worry about that right now. So he says their categories are four. Aqsamuhuma, right? The categories of the words insofar as they indicate the meanings, right? Because this is not a categorization of the Quran, but he's saying, i.e., the Quran as a text, which is the words insofar as they indicate the meanings. In this sense, if you consider the words of the Quran insofar as they indicate meanings, they are divided into 4 investigations, right? And that's what we'll look at after we pause for Maghrib, inshallah. That we'll look at the words and meanings, that, and so that you go from the words. How are meanings established? How do you have a word? The word has a meaning, right? So you go from the ascription of the meaning to the word, how clearly it is ascribed to it. Then, is it being used literally or metaphorically? And then how do we deduce meanings from the text? So there's a 4, some divided into 5 stage process, right? And we'll look at that after we pause. So it works this way, right? That the lafz, the word. So for the first stage, right, is, so you have a word, right? What's the meaning of glabugli? Nothing in English, right? There's no such word as glabugli, right? But if we say the word cat, right, or we say the word kitab in Arabic, right? We say the word sajada from you have sujud, right? This word, there's a word, there's a meaning that is established for it, right? That is the first categorization, which is أقسامه بلفظ باعتبار الوضع. The categories of, the categorization of words in relation to their meanings, right, is how the meaning is ascribed to the word. Then that meaning, and that's what the first classification we're going to look at, but then that meaning, how clear it is it? أقسامه باعتبار ظهور المعنى. How clearly is that meaning indicated? Or the opposite of that, how unclear is the meaning? That's the second categorization. The third categorization is, right, so meaning, is it specific, general, shared between 2 things, or interpreted, right, that it was shared, but we know this is the one that's intended. Then, how manifest is that meaning, or how hidden is that meaning? And then, is it being used literally or metaphorically, right, explicitly or elusively? That is the isti'mal. How is that word being used? And then the most critical element, of course, is that something is said, what is understood from it? But what is understood from it is the result of the previous constituent elements, right? So these are the stages of textual understanding. And this is not ijtihad. This is just someone who understands the language and who has sound understanding of Arabic and has a sound mind. This is what they should understand. Right? So this is what we're going to look at. Bi'idhnillahi subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And here, when he talks about al-qism al-awwal fi wujuh al-nazm, right? In his commentary, he summarizes it in a nice way, right? Because basically, and we'll continue from there by looking at how meanings are given to words. We're going to expand on the first of these categories. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. We'll continue from here after the break. So we'll be back in about 10 minutes. بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. Okay, just to confirm, everybody can hear me?
Yes.
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 Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So, to continue, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, as we look at how um, words relate to meanings, right? Here, so he tells us, القسم الأول في وجوه النظم, right? Right? In, right? And this, a useful resource, and inshallah we should share, Sidi Zain, the, the Mujaz of al-As'adi. That's a good book. And the second edition is slightly superior than the previous, than the more recent edition. And it's a good, useful book. Don't get lost in the details, but it has points of benefit, right? It has many points of benefit. And the Mashayikh praise it. That's why two of the distinguished scholars of the 20th century, Sheikh Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi and the great Sheikh, and the likewise great Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, two of the great giants of Islamic scholarship and education in the 20th century, Al-Mujaz of Muhammad Ubaidullah Al-As'adi. Um, um, it's useful for things, but I would only dip into it for things like definitions, clarifications. Ignore the details, right? Because if you get lost in the details, you'll get lost in usul al-fiqh, right? Because this is a subtle science. So, right? So he says, القسم الأول في وجوه النظم, and وجوه النظم, right? In the ways, يعني, literally wujuh is the way. Wujuh is the aspects, right? The aspects, meaning the ways that the meanings are affirmed for the words, right? Right? So he says, في اعتبارات النظم, the considerations with respect to the words, they say هيئة ومادة, in the wording and the مادة اللغوية, and how that meaning was affirmed for the words, right? So that's wujuh al-nazm, which is why Maulana al-As'adi referred to it as أقسامه باعتبار الوضع, right? The categorization of words and meanings insofar as how the meaning was affirmed for the word. And here, the commentator, who's the author himself, Maulana Hassan al-Aqhisari, he says, because a word can either indicate one meaning or more. A word, insofar as the meaning or placed for it, could indicate one meaning or more than one meaning. Right? So, right? So the word could indicate one meaning or more than one meaning. If it indicates one meaning, right? Then, if it indicates that meaning to a singular, right? To a singular, that's what they mean by على الانفراد. It indicates one meaning to a singular matter, whether a category, a type, or an individual. That's called the khas, the specific. If it indicates one meaning, but that meaning relates not to an individual, right? An individual, whether a category, type, or person, but rather it indicates one meaning, but that is shared more broadly, that is called the am, the general. So one meaning that is shared, and we'll come to the definitions of each, right? So that is the first two of these, the khas and the am, the specific and the general. It's one meaning, either specific, yeah, that one meaning for a particular, that is a specific, or one meaning that is shared, and that is the am, or the word, insofar as the meaning was ascribed to it, it could indicate more than one meaning. Right? When one word in the ascription of the meaning to it, right, more than one meaning was ascribed to a word, this is the Mushtaraq. And from the Mushtaraq, you have the Mu'awwal, which is that which indicates more than one meaning, but a meaning predominates. So the word, if it indicates more than one meaning, if it remains indicating more than one meaning, it is the shared, the Mushtaraq. Right? Which is, it indicates more than one meaning, and that meaning remains shared. Right? So, for example, the word ayn, and we'll come to the definitions of each. Or in the wada' al-lugha, in the wada', there's more than one meaning ascribed, but one meaning preponderates. Tarajjaha, that is called the mu'awwal. Right? That is called the mu'awwal. Now, there are a few ways that mu'awwal is written, because there's more than one norm for how do you deal with hamzas, right? Right? It's normally written, the hamza is on a waw, and there's a waw after it. But you'll notice if in al-As'adi, for example, because there are different masalik and that returns to sarf and so on, right? I don't think he puts the second waw, and that's outside our scope right now, right? So this is what we're going to be looking at, right? Now, how words got assigned their meanings, this is from ilm al-lugha, right? From the sciences of the Arabic language, there's the discussion, right? There's a number of sciences, amongst them what's called ilm al-wada', at how meanings are established for words. And some of these sciences are very important, right? Especially in an age where, right, that relationship, we have to, as we progress in our knowledge, have to be able to defend textual interpretation, right? We are textualists. We're not literalist textualists, right? We are balanced, reasonable, balanced, rational textual interpretation, right? So we believe that the mind has principles by which it operates with objective soundness, and that is the subject matter of logic, the principles of sound reason, and that is required. So to be able to operate in usul al-fiqh properly, and not just as a parrot, but to understand, you need logic. And I was talking to an advanced student recently, and he was talking about, he studied one book in logic, said, I think that's enough. I said, if you just want to be like superficial, then you can just fake it, right? But you need, the Talib Imam al-Ghazali's advice in the book of knowledge, any student of knowledge needs to reach haddul iqtisad, a solid intermediate level, right? By classical definitions in each of the sciences, right? So to appreciate this definition, right, this breakdown, you need, further, I'm not saying right now, you need logic, right? Why? Because there are sound principles of reason. But you need to go further in logic appreciate why we affirm logic is the way it is, and number two, to be able to defend from reconceptions of how the mind works, right? Right? Which are dangerous, because if you accept certain conceptualizations, their implication would be that there is no revelation, right? There is no truth, or the truth there may be truth, but it's relative, all kinds of things. And that's why, be careful. You just go to Amazon.com or ethicalbooks.ca or whatever place you go, find some book, how the mind works. Great, let me go, right? And alhamdulillah, most people don't think deeply enough. But if you were to map out the implications of a lot of what you read, the implication would be you shouldn't believe, right? Right? For those of you who read. And that's why often intelligent people are more susceptible to harm in their deen than fools, right? Because fools remain safe. But it's like when there's a battle going on, the coward is safe, right? They're hiding. They don't want to go into battle, right? But the one who has some courage, they go to the battle, they're going to get slaughtered. Why? Because they didn't train. So they're courageous, and I'm the village strong boy. But you go up against the armies of falsehood, they're going to slaughter you, right? So if you want to go into battle, that's a noble quest, but it shouldn't be a quixotic quest, right? They just go there with Sancho Panza next to you and attack, right? But rather get the requisite training, right? Get the requisite training. So you need logic, and it's very important, right? Because there's a lot of work to do, folks. Likewise, you need the science of language. A lot of people just do basic grammar and they get functional. But why does the grammar work the way it does? In our times, is a questioning of grammar, right? Right? Because the questioning of everything, things fall apart, right? Right? The center cannot hold, but we believe in that Sirat al-Mustaqim. There's an intellectual Sirat al-Mustaqim. There's a Sirat al-Mustaqim in the language. And that's very important. But you won't get that with just the Ajurumiyya or just Qatr al-Nada. You need to get into the depths of the language to get these things. And things like Ilm al-Wada are important in their due places to understand what's the relation between words and meanings. This is a concern of the theologians, a concern of logic, it's a concern of language. But there's also the issue of where did meanings come from? And if you want a little bit of enticement for things like this, there's a beautiful book of Imam al-Suyuti called al-Iqtirah on the science, which he wrote tremendously about, Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, called Usul al-Lugha, on the underlying principles of language. This is of the things that the ulama talk about. Where does language come from? How did the meanings get ascribed to words? And Al-Fasi has a really good commentary on Al-Iqtirah of Imam al-Suyuti, right? And there's many other works, and the larger works of Usul al-Fiqh talk about these things. But you need to bring these sciences together, otherwise you're just doing whatever, parroting. So these instrumental sciences are keys. But then being able to connect them with the revelation, right? And to cultivate so that cultivates the mind, but you also need to cultivate your faith to be able to pursue the challenges before us, right? Because as Imam al-Subki puts it, like, who can engage in the intellectual battles of any age? He was talking his time about what is the ruling of engaging in scholastic theology, in deep theological matters, right? He said there are three conditions. But the same thing applies to deal with the intellectual challenges of any age. That you need deep knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah, and deep knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah through deep knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah through deep knowledge of the Islamic sciences. And that's when you reach a level where your knowledge of the Islamic science, you have deep, strong, precise knowledge of the Islamic sciences, but you're then able to connect that deep, strong, precise knowledge back to their revelationary sources, right? So you understand that, and you have clarity about that. How does it come from? And you can test that understanding, and you can convey that understanding, and you can defend that understanding, right? So deep knowledge of the Islamic sciences and their derivation from the Quran and the Sunnah, which is not just to parrot some proofs, but it's more than that. So you have the tools, usul all the different usul sciences. Right? We just begin those in level 2. We just begin those. This is just the alphabet of the instrumental sciences, right? We want to become literate and eloquent and be able to engage with them. That's number 1. Right? Deep knowledge of the Islamic sciences and their connection to the Quran and Sunnah. Number 2, he says, is one needs a sharp intellect. And some people are born with a sharp intellect, but that needs to be cultivated. That needs to be cultivated. That's the role of sciences such as logic. Right? Logic. Directly, this subject matter of logic, of mantiq, of ilm adab al-bahth wal-munadara, the science of research and debate. But the sharp mind is cultivated through proper study of the Islamic sciences, right? Islamic sciences that are taught as a training of the seeker, and not just a open your mouth and swallow. Study the Slurpee method. The Slurpee method will just make burpee students, right? They just burp something out. That's not knowledge, right? It's a pale imitation. That's only 2 of 3 elements, right? But the critical foundation underlying that is one needs strength of faith, and that is cultivated by lived spirituality, right? One needs the strength of faith because the mind as a tool is limited, right? But in engaging with issues, you're going to come to dead ends where you don't know the answer. You will come across arguments that you don't know the response to. That you will find challenges that if you don't have rusukhul qadam, you're not firm-footed in your iman. Al-rasikhuna fil ilm, firm-footed in knowledge, and rasikhuna fil ilm, those firm-footed in knowledge are those ترسخ الإيمان في قلوبهم, right? That the knowledge became deep-rooted in their hearts and gave fruit, right, in their spiritual consciousness. Right? So they have, so that, and they also have that divine assistance. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ. Be mindful of Allah, and He'll be mindful of you. And Allah, and He will teach you. احفظ الله يحفظك. Guard Allah, and He will guard you. احفظ الله تجده تجاهك. Guard Allah, remain guarding of Allah, and you'll find Him before you, right? And that enables you to navigate these things. That's what gave tawfiq to the great giants of Islamic scholarship, right? So that's important, because to appreciate that, right? And the ulama of usul take that at this level as a given, right? But we affirm, right, that words have meanings. Those meanings are, we can verifiable in their establishment, And revelation is using those, the revelation comes in its textual manifestation, which is the, the Quran as the book of God, right? It comes in human words, in human language, as words that affirm meanings, right? That affirm meanings. And those meanings address those of intellect, right? That definition that Khan Saab was explaining earlier to you guys in the review component, right? Right? That we affirm. There's the intellect, and it has a quality, we understand the intellect to be a certain way and to operate in a certain way, and that operation is sound. It corresponds to what we understand reality to be, and that is verifiable. That of the things that intermediate theology discusses and works like the Aqaid al-Nasafiyya and so on, and it's expanded far beyond that in more advanced works. And that intellect has the capacity to know what is true, right? And that capacity to know is affirmed, it is sound, it is verifiable, and it is purposeful. What is its purpose? Right? The purpose of the aql, right, is sihhatu tamyiz, right? It's sound discernment, right? To what? Because we affirm that you as a human being, you're a moral being, as we took, you have a responsibility, لِاخْتِيَارِهِمُ الْمَحْمُودِ, to choose the good. And we have notions, and we will see those. They come up very early when we look at the command. We have notions of what is good and what is bad. The intellect is able to discern elements of good and elements of bad. But revelation comes with the floodgates. Revelation, the mind has a light. The mind is a guiding light. But in darkness, if you have a lamp, if you have a candle, yes, does the candle dispel some darkness? Yes. But how much light do you have? Okay. What is revelation? Revelation is like dawn. Right? That's why people of the spiritual path say, إذا طلع الصباح أغنى عن المصباح. Right? When the light of dawn breaks, it frees you of need for the little lamp. Right? What's the tool of, so we have nur on you, the light by which we walk amongst creation, right? But that light is supposed to be in our hearts, right? But this is why it's important to bring these tools together. Our interest is not just to be sophisticated. Our interest in this is nail. One of the purposes of ilm is what? Nail al-karam al-insaniyya, is to attain the human honor, right? Just to be, and takuna aqilan haqqan, to be truly intelligent. But with what kind of aql? Al-aql al-mufid, the beneficial intellect, right? Which is الذي يدرك المحمود, right? With that which discerns what is good, فيختاره, so it chooses it to attain the ultimate good, right? So these are underlying considerations, right? But it's good to be thinking about this network of meanings, but the ulama say that you can't take all of that at once, right? But this is sort of an invitation. Please take your language studies seriously, right? Say, I did the mutammiya, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine, okay. It's fine at one level, okay. You just want to be sort of, take something basic, tell someone else the basics, that's fine. right? Okay, right. But as Al-Mutanabbi said, that's of the most sorrowful of things to see someone capable stop before reaching completion, right? Like you put bread to bake and it's not fully risen and you take it out and say, here's some bread. It's still kind of raw. Hey, you might be able to digest it, but let it ripen, right? Inshallah. So we're going to look at these, you know, that okay. So the ulama look at the ulama of usul look at the result of this. They don't discuss the wada itself. How did the wada take place? That's a question to be thinking about. Okay? How did that wada take place? Right. And but what we know is that you can apply this across the board. Any word, right? But one way of testing the soundness of something is like a car. You get into a car, do you really need to know how the car works? No. You put the key in the ignition, turn it, or whatever you do in a modern car. I haven't driven a car since a long time. And you turn it and it's on, or you press a button and it's on. It's working. The fact that the engine is doing what it's supposed to do, you know it by its result. So that's one of the ways you test the sound of something, by salamat al-hasil, right? So any words, if you look at them in terms of how the meaning is described, they fall in one of these four categories. It's either khas or am or mushtaraq or mu'awwal, right? Right? And that's what we're going to look at next. We're going to start with the khas, right? That which was placed for one meaning, for something specific, and it indicates it decisively, and that has important implications. And from that, we'll be looking at the amr, the command, because the command is the most important of the investigations of the subject, insofar as that's what moral responsibility directly arises from, is knowing the divine command. So I wanted to give an expansive background, but also to know that to be able to meaningfully engage in ilm usul al-fiqh, right, you need these other sciences, right? And in intermediate texts, when they talk about the istimdad, the sources of usul al-fiqh, you need depth in the science of language. You need depth in the intellectual tools directly through logic, but also through cultivating the legal mind through depth in fiqh, depth in Quran, depth in hadith, depth in the other surrounding sciences, right? Because all of them, each of them cultivates the fiqh, right? يعني فهم ما دق من الأمور, understanding the precisions of things. But also you need to cultivate your heart, right? Which is, and ideally you should be cultivating your soul, right? But also, as you'll see, as issues come, and we're going, just to make it clear, some of the references that al-Aqhisari gives are of nuanced issues in fiqh. We're not going to explain them too much. Right? We're going to explain them enough to understand it, but that's a test of how well you know your core mutun, how well you know Quduri, how well you know the Kanz, right? If you're at the Kanz, etc., right? Because these issues should be familiar. So that's what we wanted to cover for today. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. We have a few minutes for some questions. Bismillah. If there's a question in the chat, just ask. So there's a few recommended readings for this lesson, inshallah. See, Zain, did you catch them, inshallah?
Yes.
Good. So just confirm with me that we've got the right ones, and then we'll share them bi'idhnillahi subhanahu wa ta'ala. And
For the Muyassar, which edition would you recommend that we share?
there's a newer one. It's got a reddish cover, or a saffron kind of cover. You can, I'd recommend that. Okay. Bismillah. So things like that shouldn't daunt one, right? Like we wanted to chart this out, that look, this a noble journey. But one of the things to also be aware of, that we are in, for those of us in Western countries, that people are beginning their journeys of seeking knowledge very often, right? And we are still, as an ummah, sort of in a phase of institutional rebuilding, right? Still, so many of the institutions that were even standing after the devastation of the European colonial imperialist age, right? The devastation that was wrought by the colonialists, and then in the post-colonial age, right, where the de facto agents of Western hegemony of the various regimes that were installed in so much of the Muslim world, right, and their active opposition to religion, and the active chaos, the strategic destabilization that was fomented across the Muslim ummah, right, and the facile divisions that were cultivated and so on, right, by divide and conquer and so on. The result of this, and now the results of this, the chaos of the mass displacement of people, ulama who would be jailed if they were to teach some students, right? I had, when I was in Damascus in the late 90s, we thought it was tough in Damascus at that time. I had 6 Arabic grammar classes that were canceled. And what's so dangerous about Arabic grammar? Due to security problems. We had to, go around, like to go to Sheikh Hassan al-Hindi's house. We couldn't just go straight up the hill. It's already bad enough to climb up the hill. But some days he tell us, tomorrow come by the other routes. There are multiple other routes. So instead of going, because just about 100 feet below his house was a market near the top of the mountain, past Jami' al-Hanabila. But we'd have to take a circuitous route, go around and go right till the top, like almost the highest route in the mountain, and then come back down and hope you'll find Sheikh Hassan's house. They had to kind of like develop navigational skills. Then, of course, no cell phones at least in Syria at that time. So you come down and then knock on the door, and sometimes say he wouldn't even answer, because he knew that there's mukhabarat around, right? And all kinds of crazy things. But yet they're at it, right? They're at it. So, but there are those who are hasty, right? Who are not aware of where we're at in this, right? And you see how the scholars, whether the scholars of Sham or the scholars of Yemen, or what the amazing efforts of the ulama of the Indian subcontinent, right? That even though if you look historically at what is modern day Pakistan, for example, and India is a great center of learning, but Pakistan, if you look at the history of Punjab, right? with the great scholarship for centuries in places like Lahore and Multan, and in Sindh, places like Thatta and others. Right? These were great centers of learning that produced centuries of scholarship. Right? But when Pakistan was made, how many madrasas were there in all of Pakistan, up and down? It's only a handful. Right? In a country, even then, 1947, the population it had. Right? So we should not be fools, right, of making fun of the ulama and look at this and just being critical and looking down. That is arrogance. But to appreciate their effort and to recognize, if you're from North Africa, to see what devastation has been wrought and what efforts have been done to preserve, right? To preserve knowledge, right? Look at Afghanistan. For over a millennium has been a place of tremendous scholarship. Places like Herat and, you know, of course, forget Kabul, the great awliya of Kabul, right? But elsewhere, the great centers of learning there, and what has been done for centuries to devastate it. So we got to be, but we have to realize that there's an amana, that, and who's the amana? What is your amana before the irth al-nabawi, before the prophetic inheritance, right? Right? Fa, right? So it's an opportunity, right? That opportunity that whatever you can do is of tremendous consequence. Right? Whatever you can do is of tremendous consequence. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى تيسير المقاصد ونيل المآرب وصلي وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد المبعوث بوعده تعالى والذين جاهدوا فينا لنهدينهم سبلنا وإن الله لمع المحسنين. Right? The one sent with the divine promise. And all those who strive, والذين, and جاهدوا, who strive their utmost for our sake. Right? Fina. And what is fina? Lana, wa bina, wa ma'ana. Right? Fina is for us, by us, with us. For us, sincerely. By us, bina, reliant upon us. Ma'ana, in consciousness of us or in presence with us. لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ we, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, we shall surely guide subulana, to all the pathways to us. وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمَعَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, and indeed Allah truly is with those who strive for excellence. Right? That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, احرص على ما ينفعك واستعن بالله ولا تعجز. Be avid for all that benefits you. Place your trust in Allah. Seek, place your reliance upon Allah and do not deem yourself incapable. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.